Welcome to another session of Sitting with Dr. Lob-EZ. As the title indicates, we're going to be talking about the fall of Napoleon. But before we do, we want to talk about some of the success that he had in conquering Europe. Many of the advantages, or I guess success that he had, is due in part to the very sizable Grand Army, which prior to Napoleon, during the French Revolution, they had enacted the levy en masse, that universal conscription. So it already had a large military, and he added to that size. So I guess at the height of Napoleon's power, he had a force of nearly 2 million troops, and that is far and away much larger than anyone else had at the time. Another thing to take into consideration is that he was not relying on mercenaries like many of the other European armies. His were made up primarily of French citizens, and so for many of them, they were fighting for France. That was a sense of nationalism, or to use the old French Revolution slogan, that would be fraternity. Okay, he had he understood that in the nature of war, you needed to have high morale, and he helped build his enlisted soldiers' morale, or his drafted soldiers' morale, by frequently visiting with them, eating with them, motivating them with powerful speeches, thanking them for their service to the country, and also fighting alongside of them. And I bet that was probably one of the most powerful things for his soldiers to see, that a general leader fighting alongside of them. So as a result of that, he had tremendous loyalty, and so that was an advantage going onto the battlefield. One of the other things that he used was, as an artillery officer, he integrated lighter artillery into his cavalry units as well as his infantry, and so they were able to inflict a lot more damage. He did, I guess if we want to look at a weakness, he drove his officers relentlessly. He also encouraged his men to live off of the land, and that was one of the things that contributed to the rise of nationalism in Central Europe, the Germanic states. His soldiers were often viewed as occupiers and not liberators, even though he did topple many of the old regimes that existed, and he destroyed with the Napoleonic Code the system of privilege that existed in much of Europe. I guess the other weakness that we need to point out is he never trained his subordinates to take his place should the need arise, and so he was the major decision maker, and I think that slowed things down tremendously. The Directory, after his success with repelling the Royalist uprising in 1795, used him extensively to defeat many of the coalition forces, especially the Austrians. And pretty much the only army the only country that's going to be able to resist Napoleon and the French would be the British. Okay, he's able to defeat the Austrians, he's able to defeat the Prussians, and even the Russians as well. Fortunately for you all, the AP exam does not test on individual battles, so we're not going to go into in this video. I do have it available on this PowerPoint, but we are not going to discuss too heavily the individual battles. Okay. One of the, I guess, places that we want to begin is actually in the Western Hemisphere. Napoleon, realizing that he could not launch an invasion successfully against Great Britain because of their powerful navy, them being an island nation, he did want to antagonize the British. Okay, and so he begins to reestablish French colonies in the Western Hemisphere, and his army gets terribly bogged down in Hispaniola due to the weather, the tremendously hot and humid conditions, as men coming down with yellow fever, which is very similar to malaria. And there was the leadership of the slave revolt led by a former slave, Toussaint Louverture. He abandons the island, and with that he abandons the Western Hemisphere, looking to kind of get out entirely of the Western Hemisphere. He finds that the American government under President Jefferson is willing to buy the Louisiana Territory, over 800,000 square miles, for a paltry $15 million. He uses that for war efforts, to prepare for the coming fight against Great Britain. And this comes in the form of a naval battle off the coast of Spain, where a combined French and Spanish navy, takes on the very famous British Royal Navy. And the British are again led by Admiral Horatio Nelson. And this battle is key. I may contradict myself with what I said earlier. I do expect my students to know this battle, the Battle of Trafalgar. Nelson uses an unconventional tactic when facing these fleets, and you can kind of see it from the picture at the top of the screen. Over here are the combined French-Spanish fleets, and then this is the divided British fleet. And what they do, instead of, which was traditional, was to sail in opposite directions alongside the enemy fleet, launching volleys of cannon fire at one another. What they do instead is sail broadside directly into, dividing the French and Spanish navy or the fleets, and then encircling them, and then they were able, with their superior guns, to defeat. All right, and so this does tremendous damage to Napoleon's plan for launching an invasion. He's not going to be able to. This means that Great Britain is going to be the lone country that is going to be able to hold out and kind of be a thorn in Napoleon's side. And it also demonstrates once again the naval dominance of the British, which they are not going to surrender for over another 100 years. Admiral Horatio Nelson was fatally wounded in this battle, and again, the Battle of Trafalgar is key in that regard. These land battles that are listed on this slide and the following slides are important battles. It's where Napoleon is able to defeat and establish his grand empire that stretches clear across the continent, which would include the Germanic states, Prussia, Austria, Poland, and that is significant. All right, and so it's these battles where he is able to demonstrate that he is unrivaled on the battlefield. All right, so his navy wasn't as strong as the British, but his army is better than all his opponents combined. All right, so here we want to discuss exactly, and I mentioned it, his grand empire, consisting of three parts you need to know. The first would be the French Empire, so that's France and the land that he takes over that's contiguous to it, and that would be the Netherlands and parts of northern Italy. The dependent states are countries that he has defeated Spain, Holland, Italy, Switzerland, the Grand Duchy of Warsaw, which is something that he creates mostly out of, as you might expect, Poland, and then something new known as the Confederation of the Rhine. I'll talk about that in a second. And then the third part of the Grand Empire is the Allied States, and that would be those countries that he has defeated, but they are too large for him to take over, okay, and occupy. And so they are forced, as part of the treaties with France, they are forced to be allies, okay, of him. And so here you can see on this map just exactly what I was talking about. Okay, this is the Grand Empire. In dark purple you have the French Empire. Light, I don't know what color these are, who knows, blue. They're different shades of purple, but you can look up here in the key and see exactly that. All right, so French Empire, and these are the dependent states. The Confederation of the Rhine, as I mentioned, used to be at least part of the Holy Roman Empire, and that ceases to exist. Okay, it gets its start under Charlemagne in the year 800 A.D., but it is kaput. It comes to an end under Napoleon, so he ends it. The Holy Roman Empire. A bit of trivia, but here we have the Confederation of the Rhine, kind of as the replacement, and then Prussia, Austria, and even Russia are forced to be allies. Okay, so as I said, he uses he exports to the conquered lands the Napoleonic Code, where there is legal equality for all men, religious toleration, and that, though, does not, I guess, successfully blind people from the fact that they are being occupied by foreign armies that are oftentimes living off of the land. Okay, so even though he destroys the system of privilege that has existed for 1,000 years or more, he is still seen as an occupier and not a liberator. So that's important to note. So Napoleon continues with his quest to defeat Great Britain, although he can't do so militarily. He wants to do so economically. All right. In fact, this embargo, if you will, against Great Britain isn't really his idea. It's in reaction to, or in response to, a blockade by the British of the French coast. And so he orders all of his empire, the French Empire, the dependent states, the Allied states, they are forbidden from conducting any kind of trade with Great Britain, in the hopes of really damaging their economy and weakening them such that he could maybe later defeat them. It doesn't do as much damage as he hopes, because they respond with a blockade of the entire continent. And it doesn't hurt France so much, because they're a little bit more self-sufficient, but all of the dependent and allied states are heavily reliant on trade with Great Britain. So what that does is forces countries to begin smuggling, conducting trade secretly with Great Britain. And ultimately, when those countries begin to defy the Continental System, Napoleon is forced to respond with war, and this is going to be his ultimate downfall. We did discuss nationalism and this feeling of love of one's country. At the same time, there is distrust, skepticism of outsiders, of foreigners, even hatred. And that intensifies because of the, as I've said, occupation by French troops. So we're going to see this greatest in the Germanic states, or the principalities, as well as Portugal and Spain. All right, and so let's get to the Peninsular War. So this is in response to Portugal pulling out of the Continental System and openly trading with Great Britain, who gives them essentially what's known as a war guarantee. They promise to defend the Portuguese against the French. They attempt to, but they're not successful. But the big problem is not with Portugal, but with Spain, which the French troops have to pass through in order to get to Portugal. And so the supply lines and the living off of the land causes unrest among the native Spaniards, and they complain, as does the Spanish monarch. Napoleon responds by toppling the monarch and placing his brother Joseph on the throne, and that turns into an open rebellion against the French. And what ensues is a very long, protracted guerrilla war against the French, who were ill-equipped to fight this type of war. The hit-and-run attacks and raids were quite savage, as was the retribution that the French responded in an attempt to put down this insurrection. And this includes killing women and children of the guerrilla fighters in an attempt to bring this to a close. And so, as I've mentioned, it was unsuccessful. It bogged down the French troops. The peninsula of Spain and Portugal, Napoleon refers to as the Spanish ulcer because of how much trouble it has caused him. And here we see this artist's depiction of one of those guerrilla raids. The French troops are passing through this gorge, and the rebels have the high ground, and they are going to inflict heavy damage. Okay, one of the a Spanish artist by the name of Francisco Goya really captures this guerrilla war very well, and he depicts it in a very realistic way, that no longer is war glorified. In fact, just the opposite. It shows the brutal nature of war, and it is very powerful. And so Francisco Goya, especially in two of his paintings, the 2nd of May, done in 1808, and the 3rd of May, and it shows, the Spanish guerrilla fighters attacking the French, and you can see this very gripping battle scene. And this really is new. This type of painting and this depiction of warfare no longer being glorious, but in reality quite brutal, he successfully shows. This is probably his most famous, and this is the 3rd of May. And what you see are some rebels who are captured, and they are going to be executed. The French soldiers, have aligned in a firing squad, and what you see are, to the left here, those that have already faced the volley and have been executed, and this group right here, closer in the center, and including, it looks to me like some type of monk, Spanish monk. So they are not. So that shows you that the clergy were involved in this as well, and that they did not get any special treatment from the French. But what he has captured here is them right at the moment of their execution. So, the volley of rifle fire is set to commence. And then these over here, can't quite see them as well, but they're next. So they're systematically executing rebels. And so this really shows just how brutal the fighting was. Want to talk a little bit more about the nationalism that existed in the Germanic states. And this is where, when we get to it, we'll discuss Romanticism, how Romanticism and nationalism have many of the same desires. It starts as this kind of literary movement discussing the unique characteristics of the German people, of their past, of their language, that it is something that deserves to be united. All the German-speaking people of Europe should unite, and if they were to do so, then they could have prevented, Napoleon from taking them over, and then in the future, this would prevent just, such scenario from taking place. It grows, and it becomes much more a part of the, just the general will of the people. And so there is a figure who helps kind of resurrect the Prussian nation so that they can put up a good defense. They've already been defeated, but to rise again in hopes of expelling the French so that they could hopefully move forward with unification, and that's Baron von Stein. Okay, so most of the reforms that he focuses on would be military reform, and what they were able to do in a very clever and sneaky way was, and avoid detection. They were able to raise a very large army by training new troops every year under the guise that it was the same troops, that they were allowed to have a small contingency force, but instead of training them on a annual repeated basis, they would simply replace those troops. And then what they were able to create as a result was a very large reserve army. And so when the time comes to attack and to join forces with the other countries to defeat Napoleon, they're able to do so. They're able to draw on a very large army, 270,000. Okay, so this is just another map. You've seen one similar. This is a black and white map, again, showing not just the three parts of the French Empire, the Grand Empire, but also the site of some of the more major battles, some of which have already transpired at this point where we're talking in the story. Austerlitz, Friedland, but what's yet to come is the Battle of Borodino, the Battle of Leipzig, and then his final battle, Napoleon's final battle, is Waterloo. What else? Oh, off the coast of Spain, as we've discussed already, is the Battle of Trafalgar. Okay. Okay, so as I kind of indicated earlier, the major reason for the fall of Napoleon is the Continental System. His inability to defeat on the field of battle, or as it was the Navy, or on the water, the British. The British are able to survive. They're a thorn in their side, as I mentioned, and people begin violating, countries are violating the Continental System. The Portuguese did so, and their 200, 300,000 French troops are bogged down on a protracted guerrilla campaign, insurrection on the Iberian Peninsula, with the Peninsular War. What we're going to see here is the decision by the Russians to pull out. The Russians aren't too happy about the creation of the Duchy of Warsaw. That's not mentioned in the notes. This is just me telling you this. Although, in an earlier unit, we discussed the partition of Poland so that it ceases to exist. When Napoleon creates the Duchy of Warsaw, he takes a lot of the land from Austria Most of the land is from Austria and Prussia. In fact, no land is taken from Russia, but they feel vulnerable. So they don't like the fact that France is that close to them. They would like to have some type of buffer zone. What adds to the displeasure of the Russians, and this would be Tsar Alexander I, is Napoleon's decision to divorce his wife. Well, they're not worried about that. He wanted to secure an heir, and that seems to be a bit contradictory, because he was trying to destroy that system of privilege. In part, when we recall the coronation, the reason why he didn't allow the Pope to crown him was because he wanted to demonstrate that he had earned that title. It wasn't a birthright, but yet he wants to secure an heir. Josephine is unable to provide him with that male heir, and so he begins to look elsewhere. And so he sets the wedding between himself and the Austrian Archduchess Marie-Louise. Now, this is what really upsets the Russians, because again, they view the Austrians, who are right on their doorstep, as a potential rival. And so with the marriage, that political marriage between, which really closely would bind France and Austria together, is enough to convince the Russians, whose economy is suffering, that they need to pull out of the Continental System, and they begin violating it by selling wheat to the British to get much needed income. Napoleon is beside himself because of this violation, and then he knows that if he does nothing about it, it allows the Russians to get a pass, that the whole system will collapse. And so he makes preparations for war against the Russians, and in June of 1812 he invades. Okay, and this, historians all say, is his largest and greatest mistake. He amasses a enormous invasion force of 600,000 men, and he wants to defeat the Russians and drive them back into the interior of the country, several hundred miles, and the goal is to take Moscow. Alexander the First knows that his army is ill-equipped. It's much smaller, about 200,000. They're going to be unable to really defeat. Okay, so again, the Russians are ill-equipped to take on the French, and so he makes the key decision, to withdraw, okay, in a very organized fashion, so that the French can keep sight of the retreating Russian army. And this is something that gives confidence to the French and to Napoleon in this, in the sight of his enemy retreating before him. But what Alexander does is he sacrifices many of the cities that his retreating army goes through, to maybe gain supplies, but they burn many of the cities, and the peasants burn the crops of the neighboring countryside to prevent the French army, who again lives off the land, from gaining any of their resources. Although the term scorched earth is accurate, we don't want to get too caught up in it, thinking that there was nothing for the French soldiers to live off of that. The damage was, although pretty extensive, it wasn't as complete or universal as one would kind of, I guess, assume with a term like scorched earth. But anyway, the French still had supply lines, but those supply lines were very difficult to maintain over hundreds of miles, and they were vulnerable to attack by the Russians. I think the term that I've read often they use is marauders, Russian marauders, attacking the supply lines. And so disease, though, is a significant problem. Bad water and just lack of bathing, poor hygiene gives rise to several diseases that really claim, probably more so than anything, maybe rivaled with the weather, which we'll get to shortly, but that's probably one of the biggest things that claims so many lives of the Grand Army. All right. So there is a pitched battle just outside of Moscow. It's called the Battle of Borodino. It's mainly artillery barrage back and forth. I think about 40,000, or no, excuse me, about 70,000 combined troops. I think the Russians lose about 40,000, and they're able to inflict some pretty heavy damage on the French as well, but Alexander decides it's not worth it, and he abandons Borodino and makes his way to Moscow. Now, Napoleon is assuming that when he reaches Moscow, he may have to lay siege to the city, but that ultimately Alexander will surrender or sue for peace. That doesn't happen. In fact, when Napoleon arrives in Moscow, instead of having to fight the Russians, Alexander orders the city to be burned to the ground. Okay, and so this is to the chagrin of Napoleon. And his generals are at this point urging Napoleon to leave, but he thinks that if he waits long enough, that Alexander will do just that. That he will sue for peace, and that never happens. And so, in October of 1812, Napoleon gives the order to begin the orderly retreat out of Russia, and this is when everything goes bad. This is where everything goes south for the Grand Army. They are faced with an early winter that is devastatingly cold. The temperatures, I've read, reached as low as below 50. All right, 50 degrees below zero. I wouldn't want to march in that, neither would you. And then the other, again, disease being a major problem, lack of food, and that was a really big problem on the way back. All of the supply lines had been compromised, and so the troops were dying by the thousands on a daily basis. And then this is when Alexander begins to attack the kind of the rear guard as they're exiting the country. At one point, it gets so bad that Napoleon abandons his army so that he can escape back to Paris unscathed. And basically at that point, it was every man for himself, and fewer than 100,000 troops walk out of Russia. Many thousands were captured. Many thousands just went AWOL and fled. So it's not quite, I mean, it's very bad, but maybe not as bad as the numbers might indicate. So Napoleon has an opportunity here. He is faced with an emboldened enemy, but yet the enemy, and what I mean is a coalition is formed. So Russia, Austria, Prussia, that new, that 270,000 Prussian man army, and then of course the British are all working together to defeat Napoleon, and yet the Austrian foreign minister, Prince Clemens von Metternich, who we'll be learning about in the next section, offers a peace agreement that would leave France intact at a slightly reduced size, but this is where bad judgment gets the better of Napoleon, and he refuses. And so the coalition armies begin to attack. He is able to raise an army, a very sizable army in defense, but he lacks the cavalry, he lacks the artillery, and of course he lacks the experienced officers and the experienced men. The soldiers that he have are, they're much older, in many cases, or much younger, and very green, very inexperienced. And so the advantage is definitely with the coalition forces. He is defeated at Leipzig, as what we just saw on the map, and then that is the final battle, Leipzig, which is known as the Battle of the Nations. When I grew up, it was the Battle of Leipzig, but whatever. He goes back to Paris, and he abdicates, and then the coalition forces decide that they do not want to execute Napoleon, that the French citizens, despite how devastated their army is, and what a reduction or just a heavy strain on the population this must have created, the loss of all of these men. But he's still very beloved, and so if they were to execute Napoleon, they would make a martyr out of him, and that could be a major problem. Then they wouldn't have a leader. They would have and whoever they put there, they may revolt against, and so it'd be a big mess. And so what they decided to do is he had to be punished, but not killed. They decided to exile him, and the agreement, what he received, was very handsome. He essentially becomes the king of an island out in the middle of the Mediterranean called Elba Island, and he's quite a tourist attraction. Many people come to visit to see Napoleon in his new habitat, I guess. And he, felt, I guess, a bit like an animal at the zoo. And so he is very frustrated because they bring back into power Louis XVI's brother, the rotund Louis XVIII. And he begins implementing a very conservative domestic policy, and begins reestablishing the system of privilege that once existed, and he's urged to do so by the nobles, obviously. And there's a lot of unrest at home. The people are unhappy, and so Napoleon is able to commandeer a ship and take it back to the south of France, where he is able, and this, in my mind, is mind-boggling, because he is able to march from the south of France all the way to Paris without getting arrested. Everybody clearly knows it's him. Not only is he not arrested, he attracts a band of followers. Kind of reminds me of the movie Forrest Gump, when he's running down the highway and people just want to follow him. And so he arrives and back at Paris. He assembles many of his old soldiers, the veterans. They come out and they greet him, and it's a big celebration. And so big Louis XVIII abdicates his throne. Napoleon takes power, and he begins making peace overtures to the coalition forces, saying that he promises, to pursue a peaceful reign if left to do, if allowed to do so. The coalition forces, who had already begun meeting in Vienna, Austria, to kind of hash out a peace treaty, say no. They refuse, and they assemble their armies, and they take on Napoleon. And some interesting things happen. It looks as if, his armies are going to be able to perhaps hold on and repel the invasion forces, but again, they're inexperienced, and the weather is poor, which really kind of damages his plan of using the artillery, that had become mobile. And so with the soggy conditions, it's very difficult for the artillery, the guns, the cannons, the small cannons to be moved. And so that's a bit of a disadvantage. Now, I'm not sure if this is myth or true, myth or truth, but I'm going to go ahead and tell you anyway. One of the some historians believe that the reason why Napoleon is ultimately defeated here at the Battle of Waterloo, inside of Belgium, and some even argue that it never took place at Waterloo, just a place with a French name that I cannot pronounce. But he is met by combined forces, but the leading force would be the British. The Duke of Wellington, Sir Arthur Wellesley is the leading force, and there is a huge contingency of, it's a very diverse group of soldiers from a variety of different nationalities assembled on the field of battle. But some historians suggest that the reason why Napoleon was defeated was he was unable to ride his horse to, I guess, survey the battlefield and then also inspire his men. Remember what one bystander quipped, that Napoleon's presence on the battlefield was worth an additional 50,000 men because it so motivated his soldiers to fight. Well, that is not possible if you believe this next part. Historians believe he had a very, very bad case of hemorrhoids, and they were so painful it made it impossible for him to ride on his horse. So he had to stay behind and rely on his subordinates to lead the battle. And so historians say that, had that not been the case, at least some historians, some say it's bogus, but others say that he may, who knows what would have happened. Perhaps he would have been successful, perhaps not, but we'll never know. But that's an interesting tidbit for you guys. And then ultimately he is defeated. And here's another fun fact for you kiddos. He attempted to flee to the United States. And, because the United States had fought the War of 1812 against the British, that the French had helped assist them during the Revolutionary War, he would have been welcomed. Napoleon would have been welcomed in the United States, and so he had plans to flee, and it was unfortunate for him, I guess, because there was a blockade, a British naval blockade. I guess word got out that there were several high-ranking, officials within his regime that were attempting to flee. So he was prevented, and so he just, instead of being caught out at sea, hiding on a ship, he decided to abdicate his throne. It is worth saying that his brother, Joseph, who was on the throne of Spain, was able to escape, and he lived out the remainder of his life in New Jersey, and that I believe a colony of sorts was established in, I believe, Alabama, where a number of, as I said, the high-ranking French officials were able to make it to and, live there in relative peace. So at this point, they decide to exile him much further away, and they redo, I guess, some of the conditions of the surrender. France now is going to have to pay a indemnity, a debt, penalty for, assembling another army and making the lives of the coalition forces that much more difficult. So they're not going to go quite as easy on the French the second time around. But now Napoleon is exiled to an island called St. Helena off the west coast of Africa, and he lives there for the rest of his life, which ends up being only 6 more years. So this is 1815. So the fall of Napoleon is 1815. So he dies in 1821. Some believe from some stomach ailment, maybe cancer, stomach cancer. Who knows? But going back to the Battle of Waterloo, one last thing that I want to say. This is the last of the Anglo-Franco wars, okay? They're not going to fight each other anymore. There have been many. France no longer is the dominant power on the continent. However, as I said, Great Britain will remain to be the, at this point, pound for pound, however you want to classify, they are the most powerful country in all of Europe because of their navy. But the Battle of Waterloo brings to an end the Anglo-Franco wars. Okay, so that's going to be it for the fall of Napoleon. The next video that we will do will concern in part the Congress of Vienna, which is the peace treaty, and what they do to kind of reestablish their plan to reestablish lasting peace. All right, thank you.